say that that is a strategic mistake on the part of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. That there are literally millions of people around the world whose ancestors were once part of us. They were torn away from us in most instances against their will. They were kidnapped from our people. And yet somehow, incredibly, they managed to cling as best they could to some sense of Jewishness, some sense of Jewish identity. And now many of them are knocking on our collective door and asking to be allowed back in. So I felt that I had found my calling, and that's what prompted me to start Shavei, with the aim of reaching out to these communities.
I see. And so B'nai Menashe, I'm surmising, was really your first group that you dealt with, correct?
Yes, very much so.
And so after they approached you and they the information that they gave you seemed to verify, everything that they were saying, how did you actually come to the conclusion, or were you able to prove, I presume, to the rabbinate that they were actually Jewish, or did they have to go through some type of a conversion process?
So I visited there quite a number of times and spent a great deal of time researching their history and traditions and their customs. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of some of the things I found, which I found very persuasive. In the springtime, the B'nai Menashe had a festival, which in their language was called Chapcharkut. And a few days before the festival, everyone in the village would have to clean their home out thoroughly and remove any bread that they might have. On the day of the festival, the villagers would gather in the village square at an altar, at a mizbeach that the village priest had built. And they would take an animal or a chicken, depending on what was available, and the village priest would slaughter the animal. He would receive the blood and take some of the blood and then put it on the doorpost of his home. He would splatter it on the sides of the altar and then bury the rest of the blood. He would then take the carcass of the animal and he would have to separate the meat from the bones very carefully, because if even one bone were to break, then it would invalidate the use of the animal in the sacrificial rite, which is exactly what the Torah says about the Passover sacrifice, the Korban Pesach, etzem lo tishbaru bo, you shall not break a bone in it. The priest would then offer that sacrifice up to God, and he would recite a series of ancient prayers and chants. And we have the text of many of them. The central one was known as the Song of Miriam, which was a detailed account of how their ancestors, the B'nai Menashe's ancestors, fled slavery in Egypt, were guided through the desert by a pillar of fire and clouds of glory, by the Ananei HaKavod, until they reached Sion. It was in effect their Haggadah of Pesach. Another example, the B'nai Menashe they live in the northeastern part of India. It's a very remote area. It's along the border of Burma and Bangladesh. And they had a custom that whenever there was a natural disaster in that part of the world, which unfortunately was quite often, such as an earthquake, the men of the village would run out of their homes, they would throw their hands up to heaven, and they would chant in their language, "We, the children of Manasseh, still live. We, the children of Manasseh, still live," as if to appease God and to say, we haven't forgotten who we are. About 4 years ago already, there happened to be a delegation of rabbis that we had sent to northeastern India, and there was a large earthquake that struck the Indian state of Manipur very early in the morning. And the rabbis ran out of our center, and they saw people still performing this custom, running out of the house and chanting. And they asked some of them about it, and they added an interesting point, which was that They believed that the earthquake, that the shaking of the ground under their feet was a way for God to remind them that the land on which they stood in northeastern India was a temporary abode. It was as if God was saying, just remember, you are in exile. You are not in the place where you belong. There are many other such examples. And when I put all those together, like I said, I became convinced. And in 2004, I approached Israel's Sephardic chief rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo Amar, at the time, and I asked him to study the community. And he did so. He sent some dayanim, some rabbinical judges, to India for about 2.5 weeks. And they came back and reported their findings to him. He conducted some further inquiries. And then in March of 2005, Rabbi Amar ruled that he recognized the Bnei Menashe as a collective group, as Zera Yisrael, as descendants of Israel. But he said, on an individual level, on an individual basis, they would each have to go through a conversion to remove any doubts about their personal status. So that, in effect, is what happens. My organization, Shavei Israel, working with the Israeli government and the chief rabbinate, we have brought more than 4,000 Bnei Menashe on Aliyah so far, all of whom have undergone a full giyur, a full conversion by the chief rabbinate. And at the end of the day, of course, that removes any doubts about their status, and it enables them to integrate fully into Israeli and Jewish society.
And today, do they still keep any different customs or communal activities that are radically different than ones that we would be used to?
No, back in the 1980s, before I entered the picture, they made their first contact with Western Jewry. And it was at that point that they embraced what we would recognize as contemporary Orthodox Judaism. And they live in practice as Orthodox Jews till today. They are spread out in more than 50 communities throughout northeastern India, each of which centers around a synagogue. They have mikvaot, they have ritual baths, they have their own educational system in many communities. I'm sure they argue a lot among themselves as well. So that they have everything that a good, strong Jewish community would have. And I remember on my first visit there, we arrived at some far-flung village, and it was mincha time. It was time for the afternoon prayer. And there was just a charming, lovely structure made out of bamboo in the center of the village, which was the synagogue. And myself and the other members of the delegation went to join the service. And during the Amidah, during the Shemona Esrei prayer, when you closed your eyes and you listened to the davening, you could easily have just forgotten that you were standing in the middle of a jungle in northeastern India. You could have thought you were in New York or London or even Bnei Brak.
Wow, it's quite remarkable. And for the most part, have they come en masse to make Aliyah, or are there still significant numbers of them that are still behind?
There are still 6,500 of them in India, all of whom are waiting to come. They have a very, very strong sense of return, which is both spiritual and geographical. They want to return to the Jewish people, and they want to return to the land of their ancestors, the land of Israel. We are hopeful that in the coming year, we will be able to bring another group of about 700 of them. And the goal is eventually to bring all of them who wish to come here, to bring them home to Jerusalem.
And what hesitates them from happening? Is it finances?
In part, it's finances. My organization, like I said, we work with the Israeli government, and we're responsible for covering the costs of bringing the immigrants from India to Israel, as well as covering some of their initial absorption costs. The government covers most of the absorption costs. So it's usually a struggle with the bureaucracy. Everyone loves Aliyah, but they don't love to pay for it as much. It's often a bit of a battle to get the necessary permission to bring larger numbers. But with God's help, slowly but surely, we've almost reached a point where nearly half of the entire community is in Israel, and we're determined to keep going.
I see. And when they're in Israel, do they create their own communities within cities where they stay together and continue, the relationships with each other and so forth?
Well, one of the things I did years ago, when the numbers, thank God, began to grow in size, was I studied the Ethiopian Aliyah and the absorption process to try and learn from some of the mistakes that were made and how Israel absorbed the Ethiopian Jews. Obviously, most of those mistakes were made coming from a good place. They weren't done, God forbid, out of malice. But just to give an example, in some instances, Israel would take 1,000 Ethiopian immigrants and put them all in one town together so that they would have each other. The problem with that approach was that it often created a bit of a bubble that people didn't want to leave. And that affected their ability to integrate or be absorbed into Israeli society. So what we do with the B'nai Menashe is we built an entirely different model. We settled the B'nai Menashe in smaller groups of about 25 to 50 families in particular communities or municipalities in Israel, so that it's enough of a social group that they have people from the old country that they can hang out with and all that, but it's not too big that it becomes a bubble. And in effect, it compels them to interact with their Israeli neighbors and to become part of the larger society.
Isn't there some type of a certain amount of apprehension that they'll lose their culture? Even though they've adopted Orthodox Judaism as they've learned about it since the 1980s, but still, I'm sure there must be certain aspects of their culture that would be a rich thing that, from the tapestry of their history that they wouldn't want to lose. And are they able to continue with that, with those types of things, be them customs or stories or even some rituals that we may not have that are not necessarily forbidden to do?
Absolutely. It's something that we encourage them to do because as I say to them all the time, it's that heritage that kept alive your Israelite Jewish identity. To simply toss it away would be a shame. It's something of value that needs to be preserved. So we've made an effort. We've written down many of the ancient songs and prayers and chants that I mentioned before. We've had them translated. We've encouraged them to continue with traditional dance and folklore, to maintain various customs that they still practiced. In a sense, it's hard for some of them because, they come to Israel, they want their children to grow up speaking Hebrew, they want them to be fully Israeli. But on the other hand, we, like I said, we want them to appreciate everything that got them to where they are.
And how about their religious leaders? They had priests, you mentioned before, which I'm presuming, when they came to Israel, has been replaced by rabbis, maybe their own rabbis. There must have been some type of a struggle with that, no? That they had these people leading them for so many generations to suddenly change. It must have been a very difficult thing.
Actually, what happened was that they were still doing the sacrificial rites, the korbanot, as late as the 1950s or 60s, which is when they basically stopped. We're not exactly 100% sure why they stopped, but they stopped. And so the function of the village priest sort of fell away on the wayside. Whenever we do go to India, there are some of the elders of the community who still remember how the rites were performed, and they'll do a reenactment for us of it. But in terms of the religious leadership, once they came to Israel, several of the young men, we sponsored them to study in yeshivot in Israel, and some of them got rabbinical ordination, they got smicha, because we wanted there to be rabbis and spiritual leaders from within the community who speak the language, who understand the mentality, and who can serve as role models for the younger people in the community.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please, Ezra, go right ahead.
Yeah, it's very fascinating what you're saying. And I was thinking that these people might actually be able to give us a window into the past, the very past, on things that we may actually have lost or forgotten about that we did in ancient days, but somehow they've maintained it in their traditions or in their folklore or in their writings to this day. And that if we were able to study them, we might learn more about our ancient culture from them. They must have little tidbits that give us a window into those days. Just thought, if anyone's done that type of study or looked into that.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. For example, the Bnei Menashe until the 1980s had never heard of Purim or Hanukkah, which makes sense. If they are descendants of one of the 10 lost tribes, the 10 lost tribes were exiled 2,700 years ago, far before the events that we commemorate on Purim and Hanukkah. So they would never have known about them. And so it's only in the modern era that they learned about those festivals, those holidays that we celebrate. What's also very inspiring, I mentioned earlier that they put on these reenactments of the sacrificial rites. There are certain elements one can see, which, one could argue, well, look, anyone could do copy paste from Sefer Vayikra. Anyone could open the book of Leviticus and just copy paste about sacrifices. But there are certain elements of the oral Torah, of the Torah Shebaal Peh, which the Bnei Menashe preserved in the sacrificial ceremony, which is just remarkable. For example, every village if the village priest if his spouse would pass away, he was no longer able to perform the sacrificial rites. And they always had a deputy village priest who was ready to step in at a moment's notice to fulfill the role and to perform the sacrifices. That's straight out of the Mishnah in Masechet Yoma. There are all kinds of elements like that, which not only strengthened our certainty that they are in fact descendants of the lost tribe of Israel, but it also sort of underlined the power of our tradition, of that oral tradition that they had retained.
That's quite interesting. While they were still in India, were they somewhat integrated? Or was there anti-Semitism, so to speak, against them? Was there racism that also would have kept them together and influenced them to leave?
In the modern era, there really hasn't been. India, for the most part, is quite a tolerant country, and there are occasionally some problems that kids in school face. They go to school wearing a yarmulke and their tzitzis are out, and perhaps in New York or Toronto, people are used to that, but in northeastern India, it's not something necessarily very common. So sometimes the kids become the targets of name calling and things of that sort. But thank God there hasn't really been any of the traditional Western anti-Semitism that most of us have come to know.
So let's switch to another community, because I looked at your website. There were about 10 listed there. Okay, and just because I take an interest in it, and I'm the one who's asking the question. So can you
Okay.
tell us a bit about the Jews from Italy, both the Bnei Anusim and the Jews from San Nicandro?
Sure. We work in southern Italy and Sicily with Bnei Anusim, which is the Hebrew term for Marranos. The term Anusim literally means those who were coerced. And it's a term that's used to refer to the Spanish and Portuguese Jews who, beginning in 1391 and over the following century, many of whom were forcibly converted to Catholicism. And in 1492, many people don't know this, but Sicily, the island of Sicily, which is now part of Italy, at the time, Sicily was part of the Spanish kingdom, and it was home to dozens of Jewish communities with tens of thousands of Jews. And many of them were forcibly converted and others were expelled. Over the centuries, many of these hidden Jews, these Marranos, like Marranos elsewhere, many of them continued to practice Judaism in secret down through the generations. And in recent decades, a growing number of them have begun to come out of the woodwork, so to speak, and are looking to reconnect with Israel and the Jewish people. On one of my visits there to Palermo, the capital of Sicily, I met a family they've lived in the same house for more than 350 years. And they have their own secret mikveh, their own secret ritual bath, which they have utilized over the centuries to try and keep the laws of family purity as best they could. We have to remember that the Inquisition was active for centuries. The Inquisition was only formally shut down in the 19th century. And the Inquisition was active hunting down what they called Judaizers, people who had converted to Catholicism but continued to practice Judaism in secret. So it's simply a remarkable story, because the easiest thing for most of these people would have been to just throw up their hands in despair and give up and say, they tried, they lived as Jews, it just didn't work out. But they didn't do that. With faith and determination and a great deal of courage, many of them continued to pass that down in secret over the generations. And thank God we've been able to help a number of them to come back to the Jewish people. And they've either rejoined the existing Jewish communities in Italy, or some of them have made Aliyah, some of them have moved to Israel.
Wow, it's quite amazing. Before we went on, we spoke about Yossi Valles and what happened with him in Spain, and you let me know that you accompanied him. Could you tell us a bit about that story? Because the way he told it, it was certainly quite an interesting story of what happened there.
Sure. The island of Mallorca is off of Barcelona and in the Mediterranean. And, excuse me, there was a Jewish community there, which in 1435, the community was destroyed. Many of its members were forced to convert, thousands were slaughtered. But because of the fact that it was an island and various other historical circumstances, the people who were converted there, who were known as Xuetas, which is the Catalan word for Marrano, the Xuetas were never allowed to intermarry into the larger Christian population. And there were even restrictions placed on the types of professions they could go into for centuries. It's literally only in the past 50, 60 years that many of those restrictions have fallen away. So they were only allowed to marry among themselves down through the generations. The Inquisition hunted them mercilessly. And the Inquisition, like the Nazis, were very meticulous in keeping written records about the atrocities that they committed. And there are records from, for example, from the middle of the 1600s. So we're talking almost 300 years after, 250 or so years after they had been forcibly converted, where the Inquisition discovered secret synagogues and even secret rabbis who then were burnt at the stake for convicted of having practiced Judaism in secret, and were burnt at the stake. And when we took Rabbi Wallace there, so he discovered an ancestor of his who had in fact been caught by the Inquisition and tried, convicted, and was burnt at the stake. And one of the things we did was we met with the president of that region of Spain, and we asked him if he would consider holding a ceremony to apologize for the crimes perpetrated by the Inquisition against the Jews of Majorca and the Shuetas. And much to our pleasant surprise, he did agree. And shortly thereafter, such a ceremony was held. It was the first time ever that the president of a region in Spain had gotten up in public and apologized to the Jewish people and to the Anusim, the Shuetas, for what had been done to them.
That is quite a remarkable story. Would you be able to tell us a story or two, perhaps, that touched you, of any individual that you came across, as to what they went through, or some of the very interesting things that they did that that would make them a bit remarkable? Because I know that, I hear stories about how people would, somebody's mother would go into the closet every Friday night and light candles and close the door, right? That's a very common story you hear. Or other similar ones with Passover, where they would get rid of the chametz, but they didn't know why. Right. There's got to be some like this that have really touched you. Could you share one or two with us?
I'll be happy to. Since we're on the subject of Majorca, I'll mention there's a gentleman there named Tony Pina, who is from a Shueta family. And he is known as the master chef of Majorca. He's actually a professor at the local university of the Majorcan cuisine, which, of course, like Spanish cuisine, pork is a central component in it. At a certain point, Tony began to be drawn back to his roots, and he found himself facing a great dilemma, because on the one hand, he is one of the world-renowned experts in Majorcan cuisine, which, as I mentioned, involves pork. And on the other hand, as he was taking on Jewish observance, he realized he had to make a choice. And it was not an easy choice for him, but at the end of the day, in fact, he did it. He gave up the pork and embraced a Jewish lifestyle. And he has in his family a small shechita knife, a knife that's used for ritual slaughter, for kosher slaughter, going back centuries, which was in his family, they had used to, because kosher meat was not available, they would slaughter the animals themselves in order to have kosher meat. So that was a very, I have a photo of it somewhere. It was very powerful, that image of him, because his ancestors had gone to great lengths, again, at risk of being caught by the Inquisition. They'd gone to great lengths just to continue to observe kashrut, the kosher laws. And here, Tony had sort of come full circle in embracing an observant Jewish lifestyle and giving up the non-kosher elements of his profession. So that was something that touched me very much. On the other side of the globe, are the Chinese Jews of Kaifeng. These are descendants of Sephardic Jews who migrated along the Silk Route and settled in Kaifeng, which was one of the imperial capitals of China in the 7th or 8th century. They built a synagogue in the year 1136. There were as many as 4,000 to 5,000 Jews there in the Middle Ages. They had their own rabbis and they had a synagogue, as I mentioned, educational institutions. The one thing they didn't have was anti-Semitism. And beginning in the 18th century, a process of assimilation and intermarriage set in. And the last rabbi of Kaifeng passed away 200 years ago, the beginning of the 19th century. And then the synagogue that had stood there for 700 years was destroyed when a series of floods struck the city in the middle of the 19th century. But until today, there are about 1,000 people in Kaifeng who look Chinese, who speak Chinese, but who are identifiable via family trees as descendants of the Jewish community. And they're very proud of that fact. And thank God, in recent years, a growing number of them have begun to try to reconnect with their roots. And I'll just share a quick story about one of them, which is very powerful. I first visited there back in 2005. I met with a group of about 80 of the descendants. They had begun to gather every Friday night to mark the Sabbath in some way. Not completely religiously, but as they learned more, they began to recite Kiddush, but they knew that in Jewish tradition, there was something special about Friday night. And there were 4 of the young people who were particularly interested in learning more about Judaism. So I came back to Israel and we managed to get permission for them to come to Israel and study. They were 4 young ladies. They studied in a women's seminary outside Jerusalem for a year. They came here barely knowing the Aleph Bet, but it's not politically correct to say this, but there's something very powerful about the combination of Jewish brains and Chinese brains. They studied for a year, and it was simply remarkable, the amount of information that they absorbed and not just took in information, but they internalized it, they made it part of their lives. So after a year, I accompanied them to the Beit Din, to the rabbinical court in Jerusalem, to undergo formal conversion by the chief rabbinate. And one of them was a young lady named Jinjin. So the 3 dayanim, the 3 rabbinical judges, asked her all kinds of questions about halacha, Jewish law, and Jewish practice and belief. And she aced the test. It was simply remarkable. And at the end of it, the rabbi said to her, we're delighted to tell you that you've passed the test, and we're happy to welcome you to the Jewish people, back to the Jewish people. Now, it's traditional at that point for the convert to take upon themselves a Hebrew name. Women generally take what we would consider a routine biblical name, Rachel, Rebecca, Leah, Esther, or something of that sort. When they asked Jinjin what she wanted to be called, she said, and please listen carefully, she said she wanted to be called Yecholia. Yecholia. We all looked at each other. None of us had ever heard this name before. And so one of the dayanim, one of the rabbis, asked her, where'd you get this name? We've never heard it before. And Jinjin looked surprised and said, Rabbi, it's in the Tanakh. And the rabbi said, I've studied Tanakh. Well, I don't recognize the name. She had her Chinese Tanakh with her, Chinese language Tanakh. She flipped through the pages. Sure enough, there is a pasuk, there's a verse in the 2nd book of Chronicles, in Divrei Hayamim Bet, which mentions that the name of the mother of one of the kings of Judah was Yecholia. So here we had this young lady coming all the way from Kaifeng, China to Jerusalem, and she was teaching us all a pasuk in Tanakh. So we had a bit of a chuckle about that. And then the rabbi said to her, okay, it's in Tanakh, but why do you want this name? And then Jinjin said that growing up in China, they knew very little about Judaism because of the communist regime there. But her father had told her two things growing up. The first thing he told her was that all Jews are smart because they do not eat pork. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is a cause and effect there. That's simply what her father told her. And in fact, in her family, they did not eat chazer. They didn't eat pork products, which in China is, of course, a big deal. But the second thing he told her was that their ancestors were Jews who had come from the land of Israel, and that one day, no matter how impossible it might seem, one day God would bring them back to Israel. And so Jinjin said, now that I stand before you here in Jerusalem, having rejoined the Jewish people, now I know that what my father told me is true, and that God can truly do anything. And the name Yichol Yah in Hebrew means God can. So she said she wanted to carry that name as a living testimony to the fact for the rest of her life that Hashem can truly do anything.
Yeah, it's quite a remarkable and moving story. I can see not only from how you say it, but it might affect on me as well. Now these people, do many of them go back? Like they go back to China and they establish a community there? Like it must be very difficult under the communists to do, or did they all leave? What happened with that community?
The ones that we helped to come to Israel all remain in Israel. They do go back to visit family members periodically, but their home is here. We brought about 20 young people so far from Kaifeng on Aliyah, all of whom have gone through the conversion, and we have the beginnings of a Chinese Jewish community here in Jerusalem. And I would just mention, many people are not aware of this, but there is actually a pasuk in Yeshayahu. There's a verse in the book of Isaiah, chapter 49, verse 12, where Hashem is talking about the ingathering of the exiles at the end of days. And the end of the pasuk says, Ve'ele me'eretz sinim, those from the land of the sinim. Now, many English translations don't know what to do with that word, and they just write the sinim, S-I-N-I-M, but Hebrew speakers know that China in Hebrew is sin, and sinim is the Chinese people. So seemingly that verse is telling us that towards the end of days, those from the land of the Chinese, they too will come back. So I'd like to hope and believe that this aliyah from Kaifeng is perhaps the beginning of the fulfillment of that prophetic vision.
It certainly sounds like it. It's extraordinary stories. And then now I know much of what you're doing. You describe how you send people and others go out to different countries and they get to meet the people. But you have an organization. So I'm presuming that there is more to what the organization does. Like in Israel itself, what does your organization do with the people when they come?
So we actually invest a great deal of time, energy, and resources, much more in helping to absorb them here in Israel, those who choose to come. Because to simply bring them here and then wave goodbye at Ben Gurion Airport doesn't accomplish much. We understand and appreciate that it's not easy to be an immigrant, even when you're coming home again. And it's particularly not easy when you're coming from a far-flung community. Myself as an American or as a North American, when I made Aliyah, thank God, there are plenty of other North Americans around here that I can hang out with, so to speak, on a social basis. Russian Jews, Ethiopian Jews, French Jews, Ukrainian Jews, they all have sizable communities here. There aren't that many Chinese Jews, as I mentioned, here in Israel. And the B'nai Menashe, it's only about 4,000 people. So we recognize that they face a lot of challenges in terms of adapting to life in Israeli society, learning the language, etc. So we do go to a great deal of effort to facilitate that process. We help them in terms of finding housing or job training. We've even set up a few and made a few matches for them to get married. We provide stipends to help some of the young people to go to college or university or to yeshiva if they're interested. We do the best we can with the resources we have to ensure their full integration back into the Jewish people and into Israeli society.
It certainly sounds very worthwhile. If somebody would like to support your organization, how do they go around doing it?
Well, thank you for asking. We do rely on the generosity of people who believe in what we're trying to do. The easiest way is to visit our website at www.shavei, S-H-A-V as in Victor, E-I, shavei.org. And there you can learn more about the communities. And if you're so touched, you can support our cause, support what we're doing, and help us. In the coming year, with God's help, we're going to be bringing another couple of Chinese Jews on Aliyah. And as I mentioned, we have another 700 B'nai Menashe to bring here as well. We also work in Poland with the hidden Jews from the Holocaust, as well as other far-flung communities. And these are stories that are not always on the general radar of many Jews, but they're real and they exist and they're out there. And I think they underline the power of Jewish memory, as well as the power of Jewish destiny. Time and again, I've seen, there's that Yiddish expression, the pintel yid, that Jewish spark, which it can often lay dormant for centuries, but it is indestructible. And when the time comes, even after centuries, when that spark bursts alight into a flame, there's nothing that can stand in its way. And I think that we, the Jewish people, we have a historical responsibility, a moral responsibility, and a religious responsibility to reach out to descendants of Jews and to lost tribes, and to assist those among them who want to come back to be able to do so. Because at the end of the day, as much as we feel that we strengthen them, they actually inspire and strengthen us. So I'd be grateful if people would visit our website, www.shavei, SHAVEI.org.
All right, well, I'm sure everyone here will, and those who are going to be watching later will as well, because I did, and it gave me, insights into at least on 10 different communities that you worked with. We haven't even touched on South America and Central America,
Right.
Which we actually did an earlier talk with somebody who came from Central America, and almost the entire church that he was affiliated with converted. But they weren't anusim; they were people who were searching for truth, and it led them in that direction. But you certainly hear about them quite a bit, and we didn't even touch on that. But I know our time is short, so you just gave a bit of a talk about the organization. I would like to do the same. I know that everybody who's heard you speak now, and all of us who even came on this afternoon, because we find something very interesting about Jews who want to come back after all this time, and how they've been hidden. It's in the newspapers. We had a story recently here in the National Post of a woman in a small town in Ontario who went to Poland to see where she came from. Is a woman herself who came from Poland, who went back to see, and when she stood in the town square, she started to speak Yiddish. She didn't realize that she was Jewish, this woman. But the most amazing part of it, I found, was not just that she herself had forced herself to forget it. She said that purposely she forced herself to save her own life, because she was a child. But she had a son who had converted 20 years earlier, because he was sure that he was Jewish, and he had no
Wow.
way of knowing it. The mother had no acknowledgement that she was Jewish, and he now lives in Jerusalem, where he's a plumber, I believe. But he was known here in the community as this fellow from the middle of nowhere who was sure he was Jewish, but because he had, he couldn't prove it, he was going to convert. And he had no idea that it was his mother who was actually a Jew. So
Wow.
I'm sure stories like that that go back centuries are much more commonplace with what you do and inspiring to all of us. So I want to take the opportunity to thank you for giving of your time this evening, or for us this afternoon. And I'm really pretty sure that people are going to follow up, and they're going to take a look at your website and perhaps hopefully even support it. But it sounds like you're doing wonderful work, and it's been a real pleasure for us to spend the last almost an hour with you, and we really appreciate it very much. So we want to thank you, and we hope that if your opportunity ever comes that you're in our area, we'd love to have you come by and speak even further. So
Oh, thank
very
you. I appreciate
Thank you
it.
very
God
much.
willing, the coronavirus will be a thing of the past very soon, and I'd be delighted to come and visit with you there.
We would like that very much. Thank you again very much. And everyone, it's good to connect with you. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. We've got, let me think, we are going to be going to South Africa next week, and we're going to speak with someone there in the
Sault
county.
Ste. Marie.
Oh, next week is Sault Ste. Marie. Okay, Northern Ontario next week. Then we're going to cross over to South Africa. So next week, will join us for that. And thank you again, Rabbi Freund. We appreciate your time, and have a good evening.
Thanks. You too. Yasher koach.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.